When Bill O'Reilly asked Kirk Cameron to give his best shot at proving the existence of God, this is what he said.
The fact that...
Sorry. I don't really want to hear this whole thing.
In this video, confused about the origins of life, so let's start by putting the artist and painter that can't replicate themselves. Time animals make. Living matter come from non-living sludge. Here again, fundamentalists, of course, that's not what scientists believe. Life popping out of nowhere is no better a theory than life popping out of the hand of a deity. So what do scientists believe about the origin of life? Let's take this step by step. The first step involves looking at the primordial Earth 4.7 billion years ago. There it is, mostly wet, very warm, and with an atmosphere composed of all sorts of gases. Hydrogen, hydrogen cyanide, methane, and ammonia among them. DNA is a long-chain molecule made from just 4 different types of nucleotide. So the first question is, where did the nucleotides come from? In 1961, a researcher called Juan Oro left hydrogen cyanide and ammonia to stew in an aqueous solution in his laboratory under conditions very similar to those that prevailed on the primordial Earth. Left alone, the solution produced adenine, one of the 4 nucleotide bases that make up DNA. To make a complete nucleotide, these bases need to gain a sugar called ribose and a group of phosphates. Biochemists think they know how the phosphate group formed. They're now trying to find out how the ribose is attached. Once nucleotides formed, the next step was to join together to make chains called polynucleotides. In the 1980s, researchers found that a clay called montmorillonite, which was abundant on the primordial sea floor and in hot pools of water on land, is the perfect catalyst for this process. Some of these long polynucleotide chains, like ribonucleic acid or RNA, are able to make copies of themselves. The copies aren't always perfect, mistakes creep in, but some imperfectly copied molecules would have been better adapted to the environment than others. These successful molecules continue to replicate and pass on their traits, while weaker or less well-adapted molecules would have broken apart. As RNA molecules replicated themselves, they shared their environment with other chemicals that thrive in montmorillonite clay. One group, called lipids, have a natural tendency to clump together to form spherical structures called micelles. RNA molecules that attracted these lipids would therefore find themselves protected inside a micelle membrane. Because they were better protected, they better survived and replicated more successfully. There you have the first primitive cells. They look nothing like the complex cells we have today for a very good reason. Over 3.7 billion years, they've evolved. I'll tackle the subject of evolution in another video. Over hundreds of millions of years, RNA grew more complex. The single strand became a double strand, and the better adapted DNA molecule evolved. One of the differences between RNA and DNA is that DNA needs proteins to replicate itself. Proteins are made of amino acids, which are often called the building blocks of life. So where did the first ones come from? No, there was no need for God. A number of experiments using montmorillonite have produced not only amino acids, but long chains of amino acids called polypeptides. Montmorillonite, it turns out, is a natural breeding ground for all kinds of complex organic chemicals. It has to be said that this research is in its infancy, and current hypotheses are nowhere near as solid as the theory of evolution, which has been around for 150 years and has overwhelming evidence to support it. But the reality is a far cry from the idea that scientists believe life popped out of nowhere. If God did indeed create life, then where did it come in? Step 1, step 2, and why? If the chemical process can happen on its own, why would God need to intervene at all? Okay,
we'll stop there. Keep in mind the idea that he was sort of broaching there about God stepping in at some point in the process, because that's going to be what we're coming back to towards the end when we talk about intelligent design theory. Okay. Yes. Natural selection, the idea is, okay, so first of all, you see how they think about it. They think about chemicals reacting naturally. There's no life there. Chemicals are reacting. Some of them can replicate themselves, but that's just accidental. There's nothing fancy or exciting about that, but they do replicate themselves because what replicates itself, okay? Gradually, the replication has errors, some of which are even better adapted to whatever the chemical environment is that they're living in, or not living in, that they're replicating in, and so forth. Eventually, this builds up over billions of years. So it's chemical reactions happening by accident or randomly, if you will, or whatever, build up and eventually become molecules, and then eventually become reproducing molecules, and eventually become DNA, and eventually become organisms, but over billions of years. That's the way they think about it. Natural selection is the idea that the way that those things are selected, or the way that they become more complex, is the environment, quote unquote, chooses them. The environment doesn't actually have any consciousness. It's not trying to do anything. But there's an environment there, and it will naturally favor some things over others in these sort of random mutations. The copying process is not perfect. The errors in copying lead to differences in the ability of the offspring to survive and make copies of themselves. Most of the time when there's an error in copying, it's either meaningless or it's disastrous for the organism. But occasionally an error in copying will happen that gives the organism that's the result of it a slight advantage over the other organisms in the environment. And that is how it got that way, and that's how we gradually became more and more complex, because the environment let us survive, or let us survive more readily than the non-mutated versions. So we're all mutants, in a sense, according to this theory. And the single explanation for the complexity of the life on Earth today, according to the theory of evolution, is copying errors. This is kind of an important point to recognize that you might not have thought about, but it's actually when something goes wrong that there's a possibility for a new thing to be selected by the environment. So when the copy is fails to occur correctly, then you get natural selection happening. So without errors, we would have no complex life. That would be the theory if you believe in natural selection. And adding to that is sexual reproduction. Why would sexual reproduction speed up the rate at which evolution can occur? Anybody know anything about sexual reproduction? Reproduction, as opposed, let's put the emphasis on the reproduction and not on the sexual. Okay, what happens in sexual reproduction? I'm sure some of you learned about this in high school, so. Babies, yes, okay. You get half of the genes from one parent and half from the other, and they come together and they can splice together into new gene sequences, creating new things that weren't available to either parent, right? So we again get new sequences of genes which they can then be passed on to their offspring. So it's going to speed up the rate at which mutation occurs, because things get spliced together in new ways every time you have sexual reproduction. Does that make sense? So what are the two things that are responsible for life being as complex as it is on Earth today?
Natural selection and sexual reproduction.
Okay, but what did I say was the source of natural selection? Errors. Copying errors and sexual reproduction. Okay. Darwin didn't know about DNA, so in some ways this makes him even more brilliant, because he was able to come up with this theory before they had any understanding of how it's actually done. He didn't know what the mechanism was, whereby inheritance operated and whereby mutation could occur. It was proved 100 years later that it made sense when they discovered and studied DNA. But basically, Darwin just came up with the theory, and he was apparently right. We certainly can see, anyway, evidence and reproduce it of genetic mutation being selected and so forth. So, and we certainly know that genes, to some extent, make the organism, right? Okay, so natural selection. Basically, the theory of natural selection says that the diversity of life on Earth today is entirely the result of the greater and greater complexity of genomes, that is, collections of genes that include accumulated copying errors that have turned out to be advantageous to reproduction over billions of years.